more on that story. Hani Baragwanath Hospital ICU head Professor Rudo Mathivha is joining us tonight. A very good evening to you, Prof. Welcome to News at Prime. So, when the copper was stolen, basically the pipe that is used for the movement of oxygen for ICU patients, when you heard of that, how alarmed were you to hear that such a risk had occurred?
I was devastated because that is the lifeline for the patients on life support into ICU. And at first I met the news with disbelief, but our staff reacted with the urgency that was needed. We have a policy of having oxygen cylinders by each bedside. Our equipment detects the lack of oxygen immediately, and we were able to take them off the mechanical ventilators and put them on cylinder oxygen. And we waited for the Department of Infrastructure Development and the Facility Management Unit to try and detect where the problem was. And the oxygen went down at 8 a.m. and at 9 a.m. they detected that the pipe had been severed and a chunk of it was missing.
So,
in the plant room.
From when you were able to raise the alarm and when the cause of the low oxygen levels was detected, that was an hour thereabout. Now, ICU, as we all know, is where people who are in the most serious condition are treated. So I would imagine that it would be a race against time in that moment to make sure that you are able to bring in the cylinders and help those patients in order to keep them alive, essentially.
Well, we didn't have to bring them in. It's our policy to have them in at each bedside in our intensive care unit. So that is what saved us and saved those patients. If those cylinders were still to be sourced, we would be telling a very devastating story today.
And just on that, Professor, explain to those of us who don't work in the medical field how crucial it is for a patient in an ICU section especially to not have their oxygen levels tampered with at any level.
Well, let's start with you and me. As we're speaking now and breathing, we cannot not have oxygen. We may be breathing in 21% oxygen, but this is essential for us to live. If that was taken away from our atmosphere, we're dead. There's no question about it. Now, very sick patients, especially with pulmonary disease processes, need a higher percentage of inspired oxygen. We're talking about patients on 100% inspired oxygen or more than 50% inspired oxygen. So we cannot have these patients have their oxygen supply interrupted. So it was very important to make sure that that oxygen supply was consistent. So if our equipment had not detected that the oxygen supply was absent, if we hadn't had the cylinders there, all the patients in the intensive care unit would have died. It's as simple as that.
And how many patients were you treating at the time?
We had 23 patients that were on life support, and we had 3 patients that were ready for discharge. So they were receiving their oxygen by mask, so they were not on mechanical ventilators. So we had 26 patients. So the 3 patients were immediately discharged to their parent wards. And the 23 patients, I had to make a decision to transfer them out of the main ICU to the COVID intensive care unit, which is actually far from the intensive care unit, which is a problem because when you transport a critically ill patient, they are not stable and anything can happen to them during transportation. So you need to actually ventilate them manually as you're transporting them. And that takes up a lot of staff. So you have like 4 staff members attending to each patient. And the other complicating matter was we only have 2 lifts that can be used by patients to access the ICU and to exit the ICU. And one of our lifts was not working. That is an infrastructure problem.
Right.
We had one lift working, and that made us, it took a long time to get those patients out. So 23 patients were transferred to the COVID ICU.
And when you have situations such as what you're describing now, the additional layer of infrastructure that hasn't been repaired for whatever period of time, how much of a complication does it add to the urgent work of ICU staff?
It adds an immense pressure on us, because in the back of my mind, I'm worrying that this one working lift can also go down on us. And then we can't evacuate the patients. So it adds a lot of stress on the staff. It makes us worry about the transportation of the patients. Are they going to make the trip? Will the cylinder run out of oxygen while we're going down there? This is unnecessary stress that is placed on us by a deliberate act that was taken to cut off the oxygen supply to an intensive care unit in a big hospital. This is the biggest hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. That serves indigent patients. One cannot fathom what was going on in that mind of the entity that disrupted that supply. And then one cannot fathom what was going on in the minds of the department that had to react swiftly to our calls for help. So I can tell you, we were on our own. That hospital was left on its own to sort out an emergency crisis. When the CEO wanted to call Afrox to come in and replace the pipe, she was told to go through DID and the procurement processes. That pipe was only replaced on Monday night. I got the message at 7:30 p.m. that the replacement was in progress. That is unacceptable.
When you say the hospital was left on its own, would I be right to assume that you're saying you felt in that moment abandoned by the health department?
Yes. I sent out messages to the HOD who replied, I'm on leave. The acting HOD is so and so. Sent out the message to the acting HOD. I'm at Tembisa Hospital. I will call you later. My message was very clear. It described the situation and what kind of horrible situation we were in. And I started just WhatsApping everybody that I thought had muscle to pull this thing together. The Minister of Health and anybody that could listen. I thought our CEO needed support now to get things moving.
Right. The
DID department said they had no money or they couldn't go around the procurement processes.
Who's DID, just so we're all clear?
The Department of Infrastructure Department. That holds the Department of Health budget for infrastructure maintenance and development. And every year they don't have a budget, yet they hold our budget. So where is this money going to? And what do they do? Because yesterday afternoon, as you may have heard, well, in the morning, first of all, there was another incident that affected these 2 surgical theaters. And it was also another deliberate removal of a strategic copper water pipe that led to the flooding of the 2 theaters. And the intent is quite clear, to disrupt procedures in those 2 theaters.
Right.
And then in the afternoon yesterday, it rained a lot. And everywhere in the hospital, everything was leaking. The wards had waterfalls coming in through the roofs. Now that is an existing infrastructure problem. It's not a new thing. It's not that it's not known. In my department, in the doctor's tea room, it's something that I've complained about since 1998 when I started heading this department. And there are other vulnerabilities about my department that I have raised since the 1st of July 1998 that have not been attended to until today. Mm-hmm. I don't sleep at night worrying about what could happen if something could go wrong. And Monday was a serious warning about what lives will be sacrificed if things can go pear-shaped. I mean, they did go pear-shaped. We, the ICU staff,
right,
nurses, doctors, and me as the head, had just had policies in place that saved our asses. I'm sorry to use that word, but that's what happened.
Just on that point then, I mean, you flagged, for example, an issue with the state of the tea room, the doctor's tea room, which you say you've been complaining about since 1998, so more than 20 years. How common is it in emergencies, in moments of crisis? Is it for you as healthcare workers, the people on the ground, to be abandoned, to be let down or be met with a delayed response by government officials?
Well, we're used to it now. Sometimes we don't even call. You know, as long as the patients are safe, the doctors and the nurses do not complain. The nurses' tea room was also flooded. And this is a place where we go to get refreshments. And, you know, fortunately, we don't spend a lot of time in those areas. But you can't have a pool in the nurse's tea room or in the doctor's tea room. And there are also electrical wires in those areas. And they are right adjacent to the intensive care unit. And an electrical fire starts there. It's goodbye. Mm-hmm. To the whole intensive care unit. And the intensive care unit is adjacent to the operating theaters. That starts a domino effect in that hospital.
Right. Briefly, Prof, we're out of time, but I want to squeeze in this question. There has been now a rush by the Gauteng Department of Education, not Department of Education, but of Health, to say it's going to address the situation, calls for increased security at Bara as well. Do you believe anything will actually change?
I will believe that when it happens. But security needs to be looked at very seriously. And the infrastructure needs to be overhauled urgently. But as I told you, I've been calling for it for over 20 years, and ain't nothing happened.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
So what miracle is going to happen this time?
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Rudo Mathivha, head of the ICU section at Bara Hospital. Thank you for your time, and apologies, of course, for the use of the A word there during that conversation. But as you can understand, the very serious frustration of healthcare workers in this country already working with so little, and then allegations of sabotage when infrastructure meant to pipe through oxygen to critically ill people is tampered with.